I've been covering science for 16 years as a reporter for a local newspaper, as the online science editor for Wired magazine, and as a freelancer. And so, like many of you, I've reported, written, and edited stories about research involving lab animals. As we all know, animal research can be a contentious issue that often pits one side against another, among scientists, among journalists, and between the two groups as well. So today we'll be talking about how the media covers the science with input from scientists involved in animal research and journalists who cover it. And our goal here is to have an open and thoughtful discussion with a focus on the issues surrounding the journalistic coverage of the science. So we're not having a debate about whether or not we should be doing research on other animals. And so we're going to hope to leave plenty of time for the audience to ask questions, so please try to keep your questions focused on that aspect of it. So we have an excellent panel representing a wide range of relevant experience, so I'm going to introduce each of them quickly. They'll each have 5 minutes to share some of their thoughts on this and experience in the area, and then we're going to have a panel discussion and then open up to questions, and I'll try to remember to let you know when you can begin lining up if you've got questions. So we'll start with David Grimm is the online news editor for the journal Science and is my co-organizer for this session. In addition to editing, David reports on animal welfare for Science and received the National Press Foundation's Animal Reporting Award in 2010. He's the author of the 2014 book, Citizen Canine, Our Evolving Relationship with Cats and Dogs. He also has a PhD in genetics from Yale and teaches science writing at Johns Hopkins. John Nye is a neuroscientist and the director of the QBC Functional Genomics Lab at UC Berkeley, where he studies the vertebrate olfactory system and cortex using the mouse as a model system. He is part of the US government's BRAIN initiative, working to develop and leverage new technologies to study the human brain. And he's been involved in the oversight of UC Berkeley's animal research program and in communication about the university's animal research activities to the public and the press. Larry Carboni is a veterinarian and the director of the Animal Care and Use Program at UCSF, and he's been involved in lab animal care in academia for more than 35 years. He also has a PhD in science and technology studies from Cornell and is the author of What Animals Want: Advocacy and Expertise in Laboratory Animal Welfare Policy. His research focuses on pain management for lab animals and on how scientists write about pain in their research publications. Laura Helmuth is the Health, Science, and Environment editor at the Washington Post. She's also edited for Slate, Smithsonian Magazine, and Science. She's the current president of the National Association of Science Writers, a co-host of the meeting. And she also personally put a lot of effort into this conference as a member of the US Bid Committee, as well as the organizing and program committees, so thank you for all of that. So welcome, and we'll get started with David Grimm.
So, like Betsy said, I'm a deputy online news editor at Science. So in addition to being a journalist, I've been a journalist for more than a decade now, I actually have a background in science. So I got my bachelor's degree at UCSD in biochemistry and cell biology, where I worked in a couple labs. I worked at the Salk Institute for a year after I graduated from UCSD as a lab tech. And then I got my PhD at Yale, where I was for 6 years in the Department of Genetics, but mostly studying cell biology and molecular biology. And so I sort of bring that perspective a little bit into what I write, because I feel like I can be sensitive and sort of understand what scientists are going through, not only when they do experiments, but especially when they're doing things like sensitive things like animal work. Just kind of have a little bit of background in that. At Science, I oversee our daily news operation, which we're running a lot of daily news stories, covering new research, policy stories, things like that. But when I get to write, which isn't as often as I'd like, but I usually write, my main beat is animal welfare and animal rights. So if any of you guys are familiar with the case that's going on at Yale with the postdoc, being targeted by PETA. That's something I've been covering, but also covering things like animal welfare records and new strategies by animal welfare and animal rights groups to target research. I've been pretty involved with this issue of chimpanzees, personhood, chimpanzee retirement. So these are some of the feature articles I've written for the magazine. Also things like cognition when it plays into welfare. So are dolphins too smart for captivity? What should we do with killer whales that are in captivity? I'm particularly interested in issues where scientists are very divided about people that study these animals, sort of some of the ethical dilemmas they sort of have to confront themselves about, am I learning so much, as is the case with one of my dolphin stories, am I learning so much about what these animals are capable of that I can no longer morally justify studying them in a captivity? And I thought that was a really interesting dilemma. And as you can probably see from some of these, I cover cats and dogs as much as I can. Not always about rights and welfare, although that does come up from time to time. Things like, and I've written for other publications as well, but things like legal rights for pets and welfare and things like that, which also sort of plays into what's happening in the laboratory as well. And just the last thing I'll say is there's a couple of case studies I just wanted to really bring up briefly. A couple of recent feature stories I've written for Science. One that came out this year, which was about this sort of dilemma of, now that the US has basically said you can't experiment on chimpanzees anymore, and yet there are still hundreds of chimpanzees in biomedical research labs, why are they being retired so slowly? And one of the big challenges for me in doing this story is I had a lot of people saying, these chimps are in these terrible places, especially a lot of the animal welfare groups, these chimps are in terrible places, they're in these labs, they don't have anywhere to run around. We need to get them to sanctuaries as much as possible. And yet the labs that were the two big facilities that were holding these chimpanzees wouldn't talk to me because they said, well, we haven't been represented well in the press in the past, and so we're really press shy. And that ended up really, I think, damaging them for the story, because basically I had a bunch of people saying these chimps are in terrible conditions, and these facilities never went on the record to say, no, they're not in terrible conditions, we do X, Y, and Z for them. Also, when it came to procuring art, we really wanted to have art pictures showing, because a lot of these facilities would say, our chimps get to run around, and I'd say, well, send us pictures, and they wouldn't send us pictures. And so, by not wanting the story to be biased, the story ended up, I think it's still a very balanced story, but I think they were hurt by not willing to talk to a reporter about their side of the issue. And this is something that I've come across a lot, and I'm sure other reporters have as well. And then the other story I wrote, which was a couple years ago, this was a profile of a scientist who used to be at PETA, a guy named Justin Goodman, and I was interested in him because he basically, he had this sort of new strategy of, instead of protesting outside of researchers' labs, let's publish papers. As PETA, let's publish scientific papers that show that animal research is flawed, and let's use that as a way to sort of try to shut down animal research. And I wrote about that because I thought it was a fascinating strategy and a new strategy for an animal rights group that I hadn't seen before. But I got a lot of blowback on the story, especially from pro-research groups who sort of felt like the story was biased because we shouldn't be interviewing PETA and we shouldn't be profiling what they do. So I thought that was sort of an interesting lesson, not really a lesson, but it's sort of an interesting case study of what our scientist audience sort of expects of us and what the general audience expects of us as well. And that's it for me. And my email address is down there in case anybody wants to contact me after the session.
John?
Thanks very much. I'll add my perspectives as an animal researcher, or I should say a human researcher studying animal models.
Can you put closer to your mouth?
Yep. I'm going to echo many of the things David said. My perspective as a scientist is that researchers need a way of getting out to the public what we do in the hopes that the public can appreciate and support what we do, including research with animals. But we often have to balance that against issues of, frankly, personal safety and the safety of our families. And I just want to give you a few examples of my experiences with this to illustrate that this isn't just us being a little bit crazy or paranoid. Or just because we're paranoid doesn't mean that people haven't been out to get us. So in the mid-2000s or so, there was an uptick in animal activism, which often bordered into extremism and in some cases, frankly, terrorism. We had colleagues down at UCLA who worked on non-human primates who were on a daily basis, almost on a 24/7 basis, were being harassed and threatened by activists. There were firebombings, successful firebombings of investigators' homes, and so forth. In the mid to late 2000s, around 2008 or so, there was a similar uptick in the Bay Area, probably instigated by maybe 4 individuals, 4 young, very passionate animal activists, and probably some others as well. And what this involved for my colleagues, and in one case myself, was constant harassment for what we were doing as our life's work, with the idea that we're doing something for the better good. My colleagues would be threatened and harassed at their homes. Their property would be vandalized. Their kids would be threatened and harassed at their soccer games, on and on and on. At that point, Berkeley assembled a task force to deal with animal activism. I was, for better or for worse, assigned the point person for this. And we tried to think of ways of how to defend ourselves, but also maybe think about ways to be more proactive about generating support for what we do. And this kind of morphed in over the years to getting more involved in communication. My family was threatened, maybe not that bad, but it was kind of unsettling. One morning I remember is when I got a call from one of our police department contacts very early telling me that there was an attempted firebombing of one of my colleagues' cars. Going into science as a young kid, I never thought I'd be sitting in a meeting for the rest of the day with a bunch of cops wearing guns, security people, vice chancellors, talking about improvised incendiary devices. So it's pretty serious. And so this kind of, I hope, can give you some idea of why sometimes, even though we're just as hungry for our 15 minutes of fame, or at least to get the word out about the importance of what we do in the hopes of generating support for it, why there is a reluctance for us to talk about what we do. Because there is the issue of somebody will come to me and say, you know, we'd like to do a story on some animal research involving perhaps non-human primates, and I'll try to refer them out. And the first question I'll get from the researcher is, does that reporter have an axe to grind? How do we know they're not going to turn the story against us? And so we wind up with an imbalance where even if a reporter or a news outlet will try to give a balanced story, if we're not talking, and if the only people showing evidence or pictures or whatever is a group that has literally an axe to grind, then it's hard for us to get out a balanced story. So I would say there's a responsibility on the side of the researchers, but also we need help from people in the press to provide that balanced story and to find a way for us to do so in a way that basically preserves ourselves. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Okay, Larry?
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, my name's Larry Carboni. I'm a veterinarian. I'm at UCSF, just up the street a bit, a very almost exclusively medical campus. It's a challenge for a veterinarian working in a situation where all of the work really is about animal health, human health using animal models. You should know, perhaps you already do, that most places that do animal research have a team of veterinarians looking out for those animals, and that job was once described, I think, in Science News as one of the 10 worst jobs in science, along with anal wart researchers and a few other tasty professions. And it's one of the worst jobs in science because we're, in many ways, the in-house police looking out at what the scientists doing, telling them, nope, can't do that, nope, can't do that, shouldn't have done that, that's going to the animal committee. So it's a hard role to be in. My own interest in pursuing a PhD in science studies was trying to think about what we know about animals. What do fish actually think? How do mice actually feel? That should inform animal welfare policies, because if the policies don't actually relate to how the animals are prospering, they're kind of just a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork. I'll just make a couple of points I want to say as a research insider, though I don't do much of the actual research myself, and that is we kind of want two things. We do want our animal research successes to be highlighted and celebrated in as full a way as possible, and we don't always want to be in the spotlight when we're talking about animal research. So a few months ago, just as I was being contacted about joining this panel, I was reading the New York Times, tried to turn my eyes away from Trump for a few minutes, looked at the science section, and saw this article about the FDA approving drugs to treat severe multiple sclerosis. And whenever I see articles like this, medical progress in the popular press, I always scan for, was somebody from UCSF mentioned? I wonder if I know them. Well, it turned out that the person who was most involved in this new treatment from Genentech was a researcher I'd known, or at least I'd known his animals for many years. When I first got to UCSF almost 20 years ago, there was a colony of marmoset monkeys, you can see them there, being used in multiple sclerosis research. And the techniques we have to cause multiple sclerosis-like conditions in mice and monkeys are kind of not pleasant for the animals. They're rough on the animals. And so I got to this campus, and here was this colony of marmoset monkeys on these studies. And my role was looking out for their welfare, looking out for their health, and wondering, is anything ever going to come of this? So fast forward 16 years later, here's a new drug that's based on them. And I took advantage of the fact that it was at UCSF to go and sit and interview the head scientist and say, hey, tell me about this. Did the monkey studies actually lead to this development? Absolutely. What do you think about mice for this type of work? Not so good. Mice have led us to think that T cells are the big culprits in this disease. Monkeys tell you that, like people, it's B cells, that's what we should target. But when you read the popular press articles, of course, about the new drug for multiple sclerosis, there's no mention of the mice or the marmosets. And so it starts to feel like this disembodied magic rather than something that's really rooted in many years of really ethically challenging animal studies. So that's the perspective of, come on, guys, why don't you talk about the animals? And of course, it's up to the scientists to bring up the fact that the road to this development went through a lot of animals in getting here. But then the other side of the coin is when our animal research gets into the news in the bad way, rarely into national level press. So recently there was a case with some USDA-sponsored research that was bad enough based on some exposés and some embedded spies bringing stories forward that got bubbled up to the national level. Usually that does not happen. Usually it's much more behind the scenes, the sort of things John was describing, that there's interaction between animal rights groups and scientists that may not even make it into the press. And most of the press around this issue seems to be fairly local. So we had our USDA inspection, very strange law, covers well under 1% of the animals in laboratories, but it sends a government inspector to our labs once a year. She didn't like some of what she saw. She wrote her inspection report. Within a month, people who know what they're doing can find that with about 5 keystrokes on the USDA's website, and then forward that information to David and other science writers. You need to write about UCSF. They got a bad USDA inspection. And so there's that frustration or that challenge or that concern of what's going to happen now. We had a problem and it's in the press. It may or may not make waves. A few years back, 2012, we were in the newspaper because of USDA inspection report concerning some monkeys and Parkinson's disease. Monkeys get a lot more traction if you're trying to generate concern about animals in labs. Our most recent inspection related to 2 voles and 2 pigs and generated 4 letters to the editor of the local San Francisco Chronicle. So it didn't actually bring the curtains down on science at UCSF, but nonetheless, it was concerning to have to deal with it. And that, I believe, is all that I have to say to get things started.
Laura?
All right, thanks very much everyone for coming. So I'm the Health, Science, and Environment editor at the Washington Post. So in addition to covering basic science that involves animals, we also run a lot of stories about the political repercussions, the political situation, the policies that are involved. And let's see, by the way, if you're tweeting about this, our hashtag is #AnimalResearch. for the benefit of people who can't make it to this session. We've got 5 really good sessions at every given moment right now. Anyhow, some of the stories we run, this was a big one, got a lot of attention. A bipartisan group was trying to stop government research on dogs. And it's really rare that we have a story with bipartisan in the headline because it just doesn't happen anymore. There are so few things that you can get Republicans and Democrats to agree about. But turns out sticking up for puppies is one of them. And one of the things that's really been interesting lately is how sophisticated the animal rights groups have gotten. So I think David was saying that PETA is now publishing scientific articles. They're doing investigations. They're really good at FOIA. So they're getting, more. It's not just. Was it PETA who had like naked ladies doing any? Yeah, they've upped their game. And then there are all these more recent groups or groups that are getting more attention lately. One of which is the White Coat Waste Project, and which sounds completely reasonable. White coat, you're responsible, you're a doctor. Waste, nobody likes waste. And so their argument is not animal research is bad or animal research isn't effective. Their research is taxpayer money should not be wasted on animal research. And so what they're trying to do is unite animal rights people, which tend to be Democrats, and fiscal conservatives who don't want to be really good stewards of taxpayer money. And so this is one of their big successes right now is trying to put pressure, exerting pressure to end federal grants for research that involves dogs. And of course, they pick their species very carefully. And so, dogs are a big thing. Whenever dogs are in research, of course, the bar is very high and the interest is much higher. But what's interesting is they're changing policies across the board in ways that you might not have predicted. So it used to be routine for medical students to use dogs, cats, and pigs to practice surgical techniques, but no more. Now they do not do it anymore. There was one school, it was the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, was the last one that used some animals for surgery techniques, and I think it was just this year they stopped that. And so it's been very interesting to see the animal rights groups having that much influence, because you'd think, universities, medical school, doctors, all of us, if we want to have surgery, we want our doctors to be really good at finding those arteries. And so they've managed to change basic practices there. And the one behind this was the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which is another very carefully crafted message. We're trying to be responsible. We're all about medicine. So there's a real art to naming your organization. And they're, of course, having a big influence on government agencies, including the FDA, which just ended some research on squirrel monkeys, who are, of course, adorable. So another good choice of animal if you want to make a point and stop some animal research. And this was another White Coat Waste Project initiative, and they enlisted Jane Goodall, who's one of the most famous living scientists, very well respected. Everybody has good, warm feelings about her. So they got her to say that it was cruel, unnecessary, and shameful research. Well, what they were studying was tobacco, and it was nicotine addiction. And so this research was shut down, and the response of scientists who were involved, or science advocates, or people who knew about the issue, was that almost 500,000 people in the United States every year die of smoking-related diseases. This was studying addiction to nicotine, specifically in adolescent squirrel monkeys. So not just cute squirrel monkeys, but baby squirrel monkeys. So it was really hard. It was not an even match in this fight. So anyhow, the research is done, even though it was on a very important question. And then we have a story in the works at the Post. I can't say too much about it because it hasn't been published yet, but this involves another government agency that allowed one of our reporters to go on a trip with a bunch of scientists to a place where there's an outbreak of an animal-borne disease. They're trying to figure out what the vector is. It's a huge project, very important. It took we had to jump through a lot of hoops to go on this trip. But the one, basically the one precondition, the one thing we had to agree to, was that we wouldn't say explicitly that they killed the animals in order to take the take the samples and find out whether these animals were hosts of this deadly disease or not. So we did agree to that. We had to, but it was very interesting that all the government agencies were, even though in this case it's rodents, they're not cute, they're not puppies, they're not squirrel monkeys. So throughout the government, there's a lot of awareness and concern about the messaging around animal research. And of course, even though the ones that make the news, and this is a phenomenon of what we all do, are the monkeys and the puppies. But if you look at what animals are actually used for research, it is mice and rats. And so a more recent sort of line of journalism and line of investigation, and I think another message that the animal rights people are starting to use is that mouse research and animal research in general, but mouse research, as Richard Harris says, mice are not just small, furry humans. They're very different, and we've cured Alzheimer's in a lot of mice, but not in humans. So there are a lot of problems with medical research there too. And at Slate, we had a big series about this, about some of the issues with the mouse models that are being used now. So that's just to start us off, and now I think we've got discussion.
Yeah, great. Thank you, all of you. I'll start with a question for Laura. When you're thinking about just coverage of research that involves animals, not specifically writing a story about the animals, just about the research, what level of detail do you generally think what level of detail on the methodology should journalists go into when describing research done on animals, and are specific details or graphic photos inflammatory or informative?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And of course, the standards are different for print versus online. Like we show some really interesting things online that we could never put in the print paper because partly because of the audience, and there's the whole cornflakes test that you don't want to look at a disemboweled animal while you're eating breakfast. I tend to, I'm on the science desk, and I want lots of those details. But it's really shocking how easily grossed out people are who don't routinely read or write about science and health research. I think of course it varies by publication, but it's throughout my career it's been very surprising to me how queasy it makes people to read about just the basics of how research is done.
Is that maybe more reason to put more details in?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's right. I think we should, as science and health journalists, I think it's part of our responsibility to sort of be as open and straightforward about it as possible. Not with the goal of grossing people out, but just this is how the world works. This is why the surgical technique that's saving your or your loved one's life works. And I think there's been a lot of reluctance to talk about it, and that's maybe something we should be pushing back against.
Yeah, on the flip side, Larry, I think you touched a little bit on whether leaving out mention, of course, of the animals, but even details of what's going on, is that hurting the public understanding of the value of animal research?
Well, I'm not a journalist, and so thank you for inviting me into your world. But to the extent that part of the goal of a good science article is to really explain how did you get this knowledge, if you just whitewash the fact that there were animals involved in it, I think that whitewashes, that gets rid of the real texture of the story. So it's interesting there's a new drug, but if part of the article is where did this drug come from, how did you figure this out, and you don't mention the animals, I think you're really giving short shrift to that goal in the article.
Do you think there's a change in attitudes with scientists who do research on animals, sort of away from trying to keep those sort of details out and more interest in having a more open discussion of exactly what's going on?
Well, I may not be the best person here to answer that, but this has been going on for decades. There were some articles written about how Peyton Roos, back in the early days of modern physiology, advised scientists to don't mention dog, refer to the preparation. So for decades, certainly scientists have known that if you call too much attention to your use of animals in laboratories, you're setting yourself up for criticism. You want the focus on the science, not on backlash on what you did to animals. So I'm not really sure I see that it's changed much. I think there's been concern. for a long time.
I think it's interesting to consider when one shows, well, you're, as journalists or as anybody trying to communicate an idea, you're showing some points of view, and hopefully in a balanced way. One interesting thing or frustrating thing that I found with regard to publicity or reporting about animal research is that from the point of view of an animal welfare advocate or an animal rights activist, is what we see, what a layperson sees as an animal behavior is often interpreted in an anthropomorphic sense. Oh, my kitty loves me, it's rubbing up against me. No, the cat's hungry, right? But this extends as well to lab animals. Earlier this year, a very old and close friend of mine who's a producer for one of the local network affiliates approached me because he was doing a piece that stemmed out of some issues with non-human primate animal welfare at UC Davis. And he kind of got into this, and he realized that, well, there's actually some good being done here. It seems that they had some problems, but there's generally being good done here. He'd like to show, quote unquote, the other side. And so I put him in contact with a few people, and various people contacted me back, and ultimately nobody really wanted to talk on the record. So he produced a piece. It was pretty good, and he sent me a link to it, and later he said, well, what do you think? And in this piece, they had visited, I think it was a non-human primate sanctuary, and there was like about a 2-second clip of this monkey grimacing. So, my reaction was, oh my God, people are going to think this monkey's unhappy because he's grimacing. Could have meant anything. He might have had gas, right? And then on the other side, since nobody from the research community would talk to him or his crew, they interviewed some bureaucrat at the NIH, some perfectly fine person, and she was sitting in some mahogany-walled room and extolling in very bland general terms the importance of medical research, and it was like, this is not at all a compelling case. So on the one hand, you had kind of a grimacing monkey, and on the other hand, you had some government bureaucrats saying, oh, this is important, but not really making a great case for it. And I wrote to him and I said, look, what's the probative value of showing a monkey grimacing? Knowing full well that on the research side, we were kind of complicit in not giving the compelling other case. And he said, well, actually, they wanted to give us footage of other stuff, but we insisted on only using our own footage. And the bummer for me was that I know that there is non-human primate research, which makes a lot of us queasy, but actually leads to or will lead to cures in humans. And rather than showing some bland bureaucrat extolling the very general virtues of animal research, why not show a patient whose life has been saved, or some family of a patient who had a horrible quality of life and maybe had some modest or great improvement because of animal research. So these are the kind of balancing acts that I think we have to struggle to find, but at the same time, for me, the innocuous picture of a monkey grimacing, it felt to me like this could be taken in any number of ways, which really doesn't reflect reality. So I think one needs to be a little bit careful about what one is reporting on.
Well, I agree that there's the risk of images like that being taken out of context, but animals that are being researched on do experience pain, and that perhaps it was a grimace of pain. I'm not an expert on how monkeys express pain, but is that not okay to show that that's part of the process?
I don't find myself in a position to tell a journalist what is or is not okay to show. For me, the frustration is that it's very difficult for the scientists or the people in the scientific community to show what the benefit is. I think at the end of the day, what animal research is all about, it's a cost-benefit calculation. It's an issue of making a value judgment of a human life over a non-human life. And everybody's going to fall somewhere in a somewhat different place in that mental, moral, ethical calculus. But for me, the frustration is the difficulty that we as a community have of getting out the message about how it's really helping people and people's lives. So, yeah.
So, David, John mentioned balance a couple of times, and scientists obviously have an interest in those sorts of pictures being balanced by images of people who've been helped. But for showing images of people who've been helped, does that need to be balanced by images showing exactly, how we got to this help for the people and maybe what happened to animals along the way? Is it possible to have a balanced, neutral story about this sort of thing? And if so, what would that look like?
Yeah, in my experience, it's not. Because I feel like, I've been writing about animal welfare and animal rights for several years, and I always get nervous right before the story publishes because I know I'm going to get an angry email either from a pro animal research organization or a pro animal rights or welfare organization, because it's so hard to, as a journalist, we're not really, I think it's not our job to make our sources happy. We're trying to tell a true and honest story that will inform the readers. But, it's so in the eye of the beholder. For example, what is the Humane Society of the United States? They call themselves an animal welfare organization, but a lot of people consider them an animal rights organization. So how do you refer to them in your story? And should you reach out to them? I think most of us journalists in the room would agree that if we're writing a story about climate change, I don't think any of us, hopefully, are going to reach out to a climate change denying organization and say, let's get their perspective, Or if we're writing a story about evolution, we're not going to contact an evolution denier and say, hey, what's your perspective? But I think it's different for animal research, because I think while most of us would probably agree that being anti-climate science or being anti-evolution is actually being anti-science, I think if you ask somebody, is being anti-animal research anti-science, I think you're going to get a bigger diversity of answers. And so the question is, if you're writing a story about animal research or animal welfare and you interview a bunch of scientists, should you get that opinion? Maybe not necessarily from PETA, but from Humane Society of the United States, the Animal Welfare Institute, someplace like that. Because there's a lot of scientists who also believe that either A, we shouldn't be using animals in research, or that we should at least be trying to reduce, reuse, So, I think there's a much sort of more nuanced spectrum there, and that makes it very difficult to write a nuanced article, because you quote the Humane Society of the United States, and then a research organization says, how dare you quote that animal rights group? They're a bunch of crazies, right? The story I did with PETA and the Yale postdoc, PETA, I got not an angry letter from PETA, but a bit of a frustrated letter from PETA. They're like, you didn't describe in horrific enough detail what this person was doing to birds at Yale. And so, we don't think you were doing a service, and so it's really impossible to make everybody happy. But it's also I think it's really hard to figure out where that neutral line is. And I think a lot of it may depend on who your audience is as well.
And I don't know the statistics on this, but it seems to me that there are more and more science journalists who were scientists turned journalists and have a science background, and maybe because of that might tend to be more pro-animal research than maybe somebody without a science background. And it seems like maybe the default among science journalists is just a pro-animal research stance, and is that problematic? And first of all, do you think that's true? And if so, is that problematic? Laura, do you?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and I think you're probably right that as at least in the U.S., as the profession is changing a bit, and the people coming into science writing careers tend to have more sophisticated science background versus the old school model, which is that science reporters are just sports reporters who wanted to stop working on the weekends, and so they shifted desks to science because we tend to have Monday through Friday jobs, and sports has to go travel to high school football games on Sundays. So yeah, I think that's a really good observation. That especially if you're a science reporter reporting for science-oriented publications. So at the Post, we have a big mix of backgrounds for our reporters, and I think in a more general interest publication like that, it's a little bit more easy, especially for the kind of powers that be, to be captured by the why are we tormenting animals line. So I think within newsrooms there's a lot of tension around that about how to make it fair, how to frame a story. And as I mentioned, that these animal organizations are getting much more sophisticated. Does everybody who gets press releases from PETA fairly regularly? Yeah, they have outreach. They're constantly getting in touch, and they'll they offer us exclusives, and if we don't bite, they'll offer an exclusive to somebody else, or I don't know, maybe they've offered it to 6 other places and we finally bite. But when we do get offered an exclusive, I mean, whenever you hear exclusive, it's very exciting, and you want to have their reporting, and they're very good at FOIA. I mean, FOIA-ing is a pain in the neck, and it's kind of a crapshoot. You don't know if you'll get the the documents that you need or not, and so when they have like a trove of data, it's very tempting to work with them, and we don't not work with them at the Post. Sometimes we will report on a PETA investigation, or we'll use some of the documents that they FOIA'd. So it's very there's a lot of kind of source keeping them as reasonable sources, getting information from them is kind of more part of the reporting process as they get better at doing their jobs.
It's interesting that you are having debate about that, because I guess I was sort of under the impression that that's not really an issue. People aren't thinking about how to make a story balanced as far as describing animals, describing the benefits, and that people in the press feel their responsibility ends sometimes with making sure that they mention that this was a study on rats and that it may not be applicable to humans, done. So maybe one of the scientists can answer this. Do you think that any science news story about a new device or new treatment that was arrived through animal research is just by the nature of that story, is that a pro-animal research story? And do you feel like do you feel sort of a general media bias one way or the other?
I mean, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, in some ways, well, like anybody else who reads the news, which frankly has been a little bit insane for the last, 9 months, it's kind of, in a way, reading these articles, whether it's about animal research or politics, is almost like a Rorschach test. I mean, we read into it what we choose to read into it. And I guess, I'll flip the question or the issue around a little bit. I mean, as journalists who work for different media outlets, newspapers, whatever, presumably you're working for or representing an organization that has some kind of point of view about the way the world is. I mean, we've seen it very polarized with different news outlets now. And I guess the question is, what are you, when you're writing an article or a piece, or when your organization is looking into an area, I mean, what's your point of view? And what point of view are you trying to promote, or what are you trying to reflect in society? From our point of view, we think we're doing good. It doesn't mean that there aren't sacrifices being made on the part of the animal subjects, but we think, we're doing this because we think at the end of the day, there's going to be some benefit to society. And I guess I'll just flip the question around to the journalist and just ask, what's your mission? What are you trying to achieve by reporting on these issues? Are you trying to reflect what's going on in society, what the desires and what the motivation is behind people as they live their lives and have aspirations, and at the same time, hopefully trying to question some of these decisions? But really, my issue is, or my open question is, what story are you trying to tell, and to what purpose?
Yeah, I can start with that. All of those things. Yeah, so at the Post we have a new motto, our Goth motto. It is democracy dies in darkness, and so we try to shine a light in the darkness. So. For our particular mission, we cover government agencies, we cover government funding, we cover science, we cover research, we do accountability journalism. Are people behaving in appropriate ways? Are people misbehaving? So there are all those kinds of stories. And then also, it's our mission to cover what's important about the world, to cover what's important about the future. I think, at least at the Post, and I think most journalists, most of us don't feel like we are presenting a certain point of view other than truth. as much as we get accused of being the enemy of the American people. And I apologize for all of you who live in countries where your leader have not called you the enemy lately. This can get a little insular. We talk about it a lot right now. But yeah, I suppose that's everybody. Just like you can't perceive your own privilege. Everybody thinks you're not biased. So we think we're not biased, or we think we don't have a point of view, although, yeah, of course we do.
I think it's interesting at Science, because I think that's why the PETA article I mentioned at the beginning, where I profiled this PETA scientist, we got a huge amount of blowback for that, and I think a lot of that was because we were Science, and a lot of the letters and things we got were, "You're Science. Why are you giving PETA a platform? You're Science. You should be pro animal research. And this is anti-science. This is anti-animal research." Which I don't agree with, because most of our stories these days actually go online, and our online audience is basically the general public, and so scientists are not necessarily our audience. Our audience is some scientists, but also high school students and janitors and lawyers and whoever else. So I don't think we are necessarily trying to reach a specific audience with our stories. And also, I think I can't remember, it was John or Larry who said, it's sort of, it's a Rorschach tech. You said it's sort of a Rorschach tech. This idea that, people will sort of, read into these articles and just sort of assume that, sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought here, but this idea that, wow, I had a late flight last night, they're sort of expecting something, or that they think that so the whole reason I wrote the PETA article was because I was fascinated by this idea that PETA was starting to publish scientific papers. And the whole reason I wrote this article about this dolphin researcher who had become an animal rights activist, because I was fascinated by this idea that a scientist all of a sudden sort of crossed this, when she learned so much about these dolphins that she was studying, that she started to confront these moral issues. I thought that was fascinating, not because I wanted to write a very pro story about we should get dolphins out of captivity, or wanted to write a pro story about like PETA is great. It's because these dilemmas, this conflict, is the heart of a great story, right? It's and so I want to write those stories, but some people read them and they will say, "Oh, well, you guys are just a mouthpiece for PETA now," or "You guys you're tree huggers now because you're trying to get dolphins out of captivity." And so I think they ascribe motivations to us that aren't there.
Just a quick comment. I read your article on the PETA, and it's interesting that you got blowback. I mean, for me, it was like, oh, now we got to deal with this, right? Because back in 10 years ago, we had these knuckleheads, which I refer to them, we had them banging on our doors and throwing our trash around and trying to firebomb our cars and things like that. And now it's kind of gone new age, where it's electronic and it's much more sophisticated. And for me, I read the article much more dispassionately. I thought, oh my goodness, now we got to deal with this. It's another flank, it's another tactic. So for me, it was eye-opening. And again, we all have, I mean, if you write a story and don't get some kind of visceral reaction out of your audience, this is kind of, I think at some level, what you should be looking for. But I think there's different levels at which anybody can read into and interpret these stories. I think it's probably just going to be part of the game, right? You can't put something out there and it please everybody. But again, my question is, what point of view? And I think anytime we write anything, we're showing some point of view, and what is that point of view we're trying to get across?
As long as you've got the microphone, let's talk a little bit about the dilemma that you brought up for trying to encourage researchers to speak out more about the research they do, and maybe the risks, both real and feared. You suggest this is something we need to work on. How do you think that, how do we work on that issue? And maybe
right.
Journalists have some ideas too.
So this has come up a few times, and a reporter will make a query, and I'll get a referral from our media relations office. Who should they talk to? And we'll talk to that person, and we'll have a debate. Should we talk to these people who have the following questions? Is it okay if they send us all the questions in writing and we respond in writing? And sometimes our first reaction is, guys, you're hiding in plain sight. It's not like people don't know what you're doing. Why not just tell them what you're doing? And the last instance, it was that the people came to the conclusion, which I actually totally respect as well, just because a bunch of people out there know what we're doing and may not agree with it, why risk pulling somebody else out of the woodwork who actually could cause a problem? So there's that. And then there's a whole issue of the worry about having our work being represented in a bad light or being even flat out misrepresented. And there I think it's really just a matter of building trust. I'm sure many times you'll do a story and you'll be coming onto it fresh, you'll be meeting people for the first time, but I'm sure that also many of you probably also have your quote unquote trusted sources. And I think a lot of times it's a matter of building trust, to have some assurance that what your source or what the person you're interviewing is telling you won't be kind of used in a weird way. The example that I gave earlier about the news piece on monkeys, one of the researchers who was contacted me and asked me to vouch for my friend. And all I could say, look, is that he's an honorable guy. He's a very solid journalist with a lot of credentials, having served in war zones. And ultimately, my colleague's university's media relations office put the kibosh on it because they didn't trust the news media, maybe even that particular network, not to do something that they didn't like. So I think it's really a matter of, over the long haul, building trust between the people that you're trying to work with on a story.
I think that from working in a large research organization that, obviously all big universities, pharma companies have their own press office who are the people making sure that all the great things that happen at a place like UCSF are out there in the public eye for the donors, for people who will benefit from learning about medical advances. And so they are really important players in setting a tone. It's not up to the reporter reporting on it to try to promote a particular viewpoint so much as what's the institution trying to say in letting us know there's an advance, and do they want to embed in their stories, yes, this took years to do. That's why this drug is so expensive. Yes, this required animals. That's why we defend the use of animals. And different institutions have different approaches to that. Is it a don't mention the animals until we feel we're under assault or under a spotlight? Or is it try to make sure it's always clear that that's going on? And it's hard when you're an institutional person, potentially a spokesman. I think the reason you and I know each other is you contacted me for some background quotes on some of PETA's science. Like, okay, well, do I really want to be in his article as somebody who's either criticizing PETA when PETA hasn't been hard on me, or as somebody who's saying, yeah, PETA, yeah, they're raising some good points there, and have the scientists I work with say, why are you doing that? So it is really hard, I think, for reporters to approach science organizations, universities, drug companies, and really get somebody who's going to go on record and say something other than just the talking head, mahogany wall point of view.
Maybe you can address another question, and then we'll get to some audience questions about specific types of animals. And do you think that the journalist should be treating chimpanzees, dolphins, maybe even dogs and cats differently from mice and zebrafish and rats, and perhaps less charismatic, as people like to say, animals?
Well, for me, as somebody who reads science articles with completely the eye to where are the animals, what happened? There are so many situations I can think of with science at UCSF, so some recent stuff that's going on with brain cancer treatments, where all the basic cancer biology was done in rats, but then it required a human-sized brain and a human-shaped anatomy to figure out how to get these treatments into the right spot of the brain. And so just sort of like the multiple sclerosis, it's this really interesting, when do you use the mice? When do you use the cells? When do you go to monkeys? What are the limits of the monkeys that send you back to the mice? That's part of the real texture of how some of this medical science is developed. And it's completely missing from most stories, unless the object of the story is what have animals contributed or how have they failed to contribute to a particular question. So I think you lose a lot of the texture if you're not able to really get in there and ask those questions.
Laura or David, about the differences in covering different types of animal research?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we certainly get, when we had comments, the comments were a lot more passionate when we would feature research that involved non-human primates, dogs and cats. Laura mentioned white coat waste. There's also an organization called the Beagle Freedom Project. Both of these organizations, in addition to using some really kind of interesting tactics, who are they going after first? They're going after dogs, right? Because they know that they're going to get 80, 90% of the public on board right away. You know, even more so, I would argue, than chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants, whatever, dogs, cats. You know, and so I think for me personally, when we're talking about research on those animals, I tend to gravitate towards them because I know there's going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot more passion in those stories. There's going to be a lot more reader interest, frankly, in those stories. And you know, so many of the stories we write that are on basic research, you know, involve mice. People tend not to get as worked up on mice, although I think that may change. I think that's changing a little bit, and I think that once the public, I think these groups are really trying to bridge this empathy gap with pets and chimpanzees, cetaceans. I think once that is complete, I think they will try to transfer that into, maybe there may not be ever a day where we feel sorry for the mosquito in the lab, but I do feel like it's not insane to think that maybe in 10 years we may be talking much more seriously about the public concern about rats and mites in research as well.
I don't see a microphone set up for the questions. Do you? So I think if we have questions, we can start. He's going to bring a microphone, so you can get over to that. No questions? Okay.
So I write for an institution.
1 second.
Hello?
There we go.
Is that okay? So I write for an institution, and sometimes there is tension when we're covering a basic science story that involves furry animals. Tension between a researcher who might be okay with us covering the fact that this research was done in animals, and upper-level communications administrators who are less okay, who want us to protect the researcher or protect the institution. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts on how to negotiate that.
Anyone?
Well, I will say that researchers certainly have a broad spectrum in how they feel, from the folks who feel like, yeah, come on in, open the doors, come and see my monkeys, to the folks who are very, very, very cautious. And certainly wherever I've worked, it has been an upper administration, the press office, and deans of research who make the decision and either overrule scientists who want to be very outspoken in what they do, or the other way around. I don't have suggestions on what to do about that.
When I kind of got involved in this messy business mid-2000s, up until that time, our campus's policy was radio silence. Best not to respond to any requests for information or to respond to any kind of accusations about what we were or weren't doing to animals, because that would just fuel the fire. And I think in retrospect, or at the time, and also in retrospect, I think that was a bad idea, because that meant that somebody else got to control the conversation. And so, part of my involvement was to get out there and try to help communicate what we're doing when asked, and to kind of be the person that got figuratively shot at when things blew up. But ultimately, it's really up to the researcher. Are you willing to put yourself out there and sometimes maybe put you or your family in harm's way? And that's, my point of view is that I always leave that up to the person to decide, because it's their life and their life's work, and to respect that. But it does run the gamut. From my point of view, and from what I've seen, not dealing with it is just not an effective way to handle the situation. But it's messy.
Yeah, that's right. Not dealing with it. I think there's nothing that makes a reporter more curious than getting the response. No, we're not going to talk to you. Really? Well, in that case, I have a whole lot more questions. Next question.
Thanks for a very thought-provoking panel. So, with the exception of the last discussion question, you were all mainly talking about what I think we'd call large mammals, and how, it's understandable that research on them would be more controversial, but the vast majority of animal research in this country, and I would guess in most other countries, is on mice. And in my experience as a journalist, a lot of that research is pretty lousy, and I don't mean ethically lousy, I just mean it's not very good. It doesn't lead very far, it sends people in the wrong direction, and so on. And I've always been really interested in what keeps scientists working with certain mouse models that have been proven to be questionable. And so I'm wondering if, from your perspective, the concerns or the resistance around working with large animals is one thing that keeps people working with mice when maybe they should be letting those models go.
It's interesting that you would say that we were talking mostly about large mammals, because I guess in my mind that wasn't the case, but I realized we did mention primates a lot. But I think most of this probably, at least in my mind, applies to mice too. But Larry, did you have something to? Do you think that fear of more difficult questions, and probably it's harder to get research approved and more scrutiny with use of non-human primates or other animals that are that humans have more interest in, keeps people using mouse models that maybe aren't as effective as they could be?
Well, of course, within science, there's a lot of debate about. Is this one not working? Within science, there's a lot of debate among different disciplines of why don't we have better mouse models for pain? Why don't we have better mouse models for inflammatory disease? And so a lot of debate among scientists that sometimes spills over into a more popular press. I think a big reality with a lot of mouse biologists is that they don't go to work necessarily every day thinking about, and maybe you'll contradict me on this, every day thinking about, I'm a monkey researcher, my kids can't talk about what my mother does at work every day. I think they get to think less about the issue and hide behind the reality that if there's a spotlight, it's a spotlight on the dog and the monkey researchers. Even people who use pigs in experiments that traditionally would have used dogs get to sort of stay backstage more because they just don't go to work all the time thinking how much their work is an object of scrutiny the way a dog or a monkey researcher does.
This is a question for Laura. My name is Marla Paul, and I write about the medical research at Northwestern. And a lot of our research involves mice and rats. And our media relations director is very concerned about putting mice and rats in the headline, and so we always, of course, discuss the fact that the research was done in these rodents, but we put it further down. And as a journalist getting our releases, does that bother you or concern you?
Sorry, that was the acoustics in here are a little goofy. So the question is for journalists: does it bother you if you get a press release and it doesn't say until lower down that the research was in rice or
yeah,
rats?
Yeah. In other words, if we don't make it clear in the headline that it's mice, if we talk about it as a experimental treatment that halted progression of MS, but you don't learn that it's mice until the third paragraph, does that seem like we're misrepresenting it, or is that okay? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that is a bit of a misrepresentation. And for our newspaper headlines, if we do cover a mouse study, we say mouse in the headline. just to make it clear, to not, particularly if it's a health story, to not get people's hopes up. Alzheimer's disease cured again in mice. So it would be unfair to not say it in the headline. So we always put it very high up. And I do, as somebody who gets a lot of press releases, if it's buried, I do get irritated about that. I think that is not quite fair. That personally.
Do you write about research in mice, or do you?
Less all the time, because there have been so many really promising treatments that don't turn out well. Mm-hmm. So particularly for medical studies, we tend to not cover them until they've been in human trials.
In the biomedical research community, there has been a lot of angst about what do mouse models tell us about the basic biology of humans and strategies for treating human disease. And I think what's getting lost in this whole discussion, at least when we talk to the public, is this expectation that everything we do is going to work. Now, if I'd listened to my father and gone into medicine, right, I'd be in a game where I'd be expected to get things right 99.999% of the time so I don't kill anybody. The advances in biomedical research don't come about because we get things right every time. The big advances in biomedical research come about because we fail almost all the time. And it's a 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 times that it works that gives us this, big push forward. And I think, sure, whatever model systems we use to study a biological process, we have to understand what the limitations are. But the reality is, because of time limitations and financial resources and, frankly, ethical reasons, we can't start these investigations on non-human primates. So I think, okay, you can see I'm going a little crazy about this, right? But this is my Rorschach test. I mean, it's true at face value that mice are kind of crappy models for certain human diseases, but the reality is there's no other way in there, right?
So we started about 10 minutes late.
Thank
I think
you.
there's a break coming up, but it's a nice long break, so we'll just go 10 minutes over to make up for that time. Next question.
Okay, so I work at a university where I'm sometimes writing about non-human primate research, say HIV vaccine research or Huntington's disease models, and what I wonder is what triggers attention in the sense of, have John or Larry, have you experienced that there have been stories where there's someone you trust, you think they do a good job, and you still get blowback because there was some stray detail about something in the blood, or it mentioned the word lymph node or something, and then people got upset. And then I'm wondering, is it top down, like people who know how to read scientific papers, or is it just people individual activists that just see things and they get upset?
So we're having a lot of trouble understanding what the people are saying there, but
what sparks blowback? Like, where is it coming from top down? Like, are there people looking for it and then kind of sending an attack swarm at you?
yeah. So what are the triggers really? You may see a story that is generally well reported, but something in it causes people to freak out.
I'm going to have to say I don't know what causes people to freak out. I know that when I go home, my husband is a law professor who had a background in biology. There comes a point at dinner where it's like, I don't want any more detail. And so, is there blood? Are there monkeys? So that's my N of 1 where I get to see, don't go there. We don't want to know that much detail about where this information came from.
Yeah, I shouldn't jinx ourselves. I mean, I can't recall the last time we had any blowback after a press release or any publicity about some advance that one of our faculty made in some area that was based on animal research. Usually it's because somebody went and pulled the USDA records and found out we got cited for something, not that it happens, okay? And they find out, some evidence for our mistreatment of animals. So knock on wood, I haven't really seen that, but of course we are a little bit careful about what we do and don't say in the press releases as well.
Next question. Try really hard to talk loud and enunciate.
Okay, my name's Sarah Talpis, and I'm a freelance writer. I have a comment and a question, and the comment is about the White Coat Waste Project. I know that we're describing them right now as an animal rights organization, but I've got their website pulled up, and I think it's important to note that they are not against all animal research, they're against taxpayer-funded animal research, and their approach is to quote-unquote drain the swamp. If you go to their website, you can see a video that was produced by Glenn Beck talking about how animal research has never led to any useful medical advancement ever. So my question, I suppose, is for Laura, since the Washington Post, I know, recently covered this. To what extent do you feel like you need to cover this group rather than let them set the agenda?
Yeah, we would never cover them as a group, but when their activities lead the FDA to completely shut down a research project, we cover that. So we cover the effects of what they're doing, but we wouldn't does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think it's a tricky situation, though, because the FDA scientists in that case weren't allowed to speak. And so I think the article ended up, on the one hand, you have this group that's kind of allowed to say whatever they want, and then on the other hand, you have FDA researchers who are basically being told they can't talk about what they were doing. And there was no evidence, actually, that they had done anything wrong in this case.
Right. Yeah, and we tried to make that clear, and we put a lot of work into trying to find scientists who would, even though the FDA scientists couldn't speak for themselves, to find other scientists who could present the point of view and explain why actually it would be really good to understand how nicotine addiction works. So yeah, when we cover a group like that, we have an extra dose of skepticism.
Just to counter that, I'd say the first time we covered White Coast Waste, we covered them because they were new, and we just covered them because my interest is what's going on in animal rights. And if White Coast Waste, if White Coast Waste had come on the scene and said, "Hey, we're just like PETA, we're gonna do the same thing as PETA," we absolutely would not have covered them. But because they came on the scene, they said, we haven't accomplished anything yet, but we're going to unite Republicans and Democrats. I thought that was a fascinating strategy. Same thing with Beagle Freedom Project. They hadn't really accomplished a lot yet, but their whole thing was public getting, instead of them FOIAing everything, they outsourced that to all of their followers. They said they had tens of thousands of followers filing FOIA requests with universities. So they crowdsourced FOIA, which I'd never seen before. And they hadn't accomplished anything yet. But as John was saying earlier, part of it is I'm just fascinated with a new strategy. But the other thing is, researchers may want to know why they all of a sudden got slapped with 10,000 FOIA requests. And if we're not reporting on it, then I don't think we're doing a service to our community.
Hello. My name is Matt Hughes. I work for Bucknell University in a university press office, like a lot of the people.
Yeah, we can't hear you at all.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is this better? Okay. My name's Matt Hughes. I work for Bucknell University in a university communications office, like a few other people here. My question is, sort of in a perfect world where you do have the trust from the reporter you're dealing with, because the person might be someone like me who's internal and is going to be a partner on this. What is the sort of tone you do think you should be setting? Because you both, I'm sorry, should I come up? Would that help?
Maybe.
Maybe
Yeah.
don't use the microphone.
Don't use the microphone.
I'll say what the question is.
So I'll try so everyone else can hear me. Sorry. Coming from a university press office, you both talked about how your approach has sort of changed, and that radio silence wasn't the most effective approach in the past. And my question is sort of how have your universities adopted to that approach? And in a world where you would have the trust of a writer, what sort of tone do you think you should be setting, and how would you like to see the animal research aspects of your work represented?
I mean, as a researcher, I rely on our media relations people to to develop and broker those relationships, quite frankly. And I'm sure you have your contacts in the media, and you know who's going to be a little friendly or maybe who's not going to be so friendly. And so it's really just about developing these networks and these personal relationships and building the trust and knowing who you can sell your story to or not, I guess.
I'll just anecdotally tell you, probably about 6-8 years ago, you know, anybody in the United States who uses animals, there's an animal care and use committee. In other countries, they're called ethics committees. It came to our animal committee, whose jurisdiction does not include public relations, what to do about reporter requests to come and interview scientists and to go into laboratories. And it was very interesting. In most countries, these committees include community members who aren't faculty scientists. And those people on our committee, one in particular, was very much the advocate of, I come here twice a month to come to your meetings, to decide what science projects to approve. This is fascinating, you should let people in. But again, it was the upper administration that said, no, we just don't have enough control of the message. And it is a concern. Letting people in is how you get pictures of monkeys grimacing because there's a stranger in your face with a camera. And if you're a normal monkey, you should grimace at that stranger. So bringing people in requires a lot of prep work of, this is what you're going to see. If you see monkeys with implants on their heads, don't just get nervous that there's a monkey with an implant. Watch the monkey. Does he pick at the implant? Does it seem like it bothers him at all? But you have to get past that. You have to be prepared for that. You have to be ready to focus on the monkey, not on the bizarreness of what you're seeing. But those folks, those community members, are a really interesting set of people there, and they're probably well hidden at universities too.
Okay, we'll try to sneak one quick one.
Sure. I'm not going to actually ask your questions, just by way of comment. And it's a voice from Africa. And because I've only really heard people coming from this part of the world. And so it's just for me a question of perspective, because certainly I'm a journalist. My name's Adele Beletta from Cape Town, South Africa. And it's a question of perspective to a large degree, because in South Africa, I don't know of many journalists. In fact, I don't think I've ever read a story, looking at animals in research, because we spend our time looking for the answers to serious diseases like HIV and TB. And that is where our journalism is at. So it's really just a very fascinating thing to sit here and listen to how much focus is on that when we are focused on something completely different. And that may change depending on how things evolve, but it doesn't mean to say that we don't have research facilities, excellent research going on, but people are just more concerned about answers and solutions. Just my comment. Thank you.
That's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think we're being cut off, so we'll take this over here. But thanks everybody for coming.